British North America, right? Because the United States is really comes from 13 colonies that were 13, not all of British North America. There are 13 colonies in British North America, right? There are many colonies that the British are going to have. Jamaica, Barbados. There's still like the British Virgin Islands, Nova Scotia, parts of Canada, Belize, right? You know, for the first week I just said, what does America mean to you in one word, right? Describe America in one word. And the word that was used by, it was 50 students, probably by 20 of them was like, more than any other word was opportunity, right? The idea of opportunity, come to, you know, or the freedom to do whatever, that idea of freedom, opportunity, economic opportunity, right? A lot of people, some of you may have been born in another country, or your parents were born somewhere else and came to this country for a better opportunity, like for your family, economically, you know, where you can, you know what I'm saying? Standard quality of life, whatever. Another one is religious freedom. People cite this when it comes to the Pilgrims, who are Puritans, right? They were Christian denomination, and to put it nicely, it's problematic to say religious freedom is why Pilgrims came here. It's really not accurate at all. So let's focus on those two things: the idea of opportunity or economic opportunity, and the religious motivation, right? Because when it comes to economic opportunity, a lot of people, even from England, came here as indentured servants, right? They thought they came here basically. They agreed to be someone's slave for a certain number of years. In so many words, like not, you know. And at the end of that, they would serve out this term where they were basically a slave or close to it. They would get something for it, maybe a piece of land or something. So there was maybe opportunity at the end of it. But a lot of them died before that, right? They would agree to work for 5 years and then they would die. They get here and 18 months later they're dead, right? Because of mortality rates are higher. It's it's a new part of the world for Europeans. So even though they brought other diseases with them, they're not used to the climate. They're not used to, you know, how do we grow food here? All sorts of stuff, right? It's very volatile. And also you have by 1860, right? You're going to have about 4 million people in the United States that are slaves, right? That did not choose willfully to come to this part of the world, right? They were forced to come here. And then as far as opportunity goes, I mean, they're kept in a situation. They basically, laws are going to be constructed where they are intended to be slaves, remain slaves for their entire lives. And any children they have are going to be slaves for their entire lives. So as far as opportunity goes, it's problematic. I'm just kidding. So, page 55. Many degrees of freedom coexisted in 17th century North America, from the slave, stripped completely of liberty, to the independent landowner, who enjoyed a full range of rights. During a lifetime, a person might well occupy more than one place on this spectrum. But by person, I think he implies like white colonists, right? Not because for slaves that's complicated, because they're not gonna be able to leave their position as slaves. At a certain point, there's going to be laws that are designed basically to keep them in slavery. The settlers' success, however, rested on depriving Native Americans of their land, and in some colonies importing large numbers of African slaves as laborers. Freedom and lack of freedom expanded together in 17th century America, right? That's pretty interesting. That's an interesting statement, right? Freedom and lack of freedom. So not just there was freedom for these people over here, and these people didn't really have the same level of freedom. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that freedom was certain groups, and this is all happening in the time of the Enlightenment, and people are having these, are writing about these ideas regarding citizenship and regarding the rights of human beings, right? Like the stuff in our Declaration of Independence, the rights of citizens, the right to choose their government, you know, the right to have a say in the choices that society makes. That's happening in tandem with not people being left out of that, but actually laws being set up to make people even less free than they were, right? So people from Africa who are brought to this country, you know, some of the first Africans brought to this country as slaves, at least one of them they know gained their freedom at some point. One of them gained their freedom and ended up actually owning his own indentured servants and slaves, right? So he wasn't in, the laws weren't designed yet where this group of people is coming here and they're going to remain in this position, slaves, forever, right? But that ends up happening. So laws are actually being written that that make this group that's being imported less free. And sorry, I digress. London, very crowded. There's a population, what's called a labor surplus, and this is because there's problems, right? Because for a few reasons. One, there were in London or in England for a long time. There are lands that were called lands held in common. The land in rural areas that people could work. They could farm on it. No one necessarily owned it, but people could live off of it, right? But then there's this privatization of land. It's called enclosure, right? Which kind of is self-explanatory. People are enclosing land, fencing off, land, claiming whether it's wealthy private citizens or the church. A lot of times the church ended up controlling a lot of land, government. So there's all this land that people used to be able to sort of live on and survive on that is no longer available. So when that happens, people end up migrating into the cities, right, for work. And then you end up with too many people looking for work and not enough jobs. Many of you maybe have experienced in our own country when this has happened before, right? It happened like 10 years ago, where there's a recession. So there's a massive labor surplus. This is actually one of the reasons that people cite for the conflict in Syria starting. Right, there was sort of a lot of drought in that part of the world, which affected people's crops. Right, like land dries up, crops don't grow. People have to basically abandon whatever agricultural endeavor they're in and go to the cities to look for work. And then the cities become crowded. It causes a lot of civil turmoil, right? Tension, because there's not enough jobs, but there are a lot of people, and people in the cities, and people are in crowded cities. And people start doing stuff when they're in crowded cities and they need money and they don't have any, right? They start robbing people and putting other issues. So there's a desire to get people to go to the Americas. And then obviously people who are living in that situation, who are living in that crowded city like that, see an opportunity to go somewhere else where they might end up with their own piece of land, even if they have to work as an indentured servant, even if they have to sign away like 5 years of their life to be someone's slave, basically. They're willing to do that. And a lot of those people end up not even outliving those 5 years. They die, but they're willing to make that risk. That's how dire the situation is for a lot of people, right? And so that's one thing that separates England. If you look at France, you look at Spain in chapter 1, there's a difference between how they start colonizing the New World, the Americas, versus England. England has definitely is pushing not just we're going to claim territory and try to mine, take resources out of it, right? Mine for gold or enslave an indigenous population and have them do some work so we can profit off of it, just to create wealth for the country, like for Spain or for France, right? England's actually, we're sending people to these places. We're going to send people there, and they're going with the idea of we're getting our own land, like we're going to get our own slice of life, even if that means taking it from other people who are already here, right? What you would call, what ends up happening is really what we would call ethnic cleansing, right? Where people are basically, you're taking land and it's being reserved for English people, for white people, right? And indigenous people are pushed out of that land, by force. Forced labor. Indentured servants they're not forced in the sense that they sign a contract, right? They're sitting in England, okay, I'll sign this contract. But it's forced in the sense that once they're here, they can't just say, like 6 months in, they can't go, okay, this guy's kind of an a-hole, I don't want to, he's beating the hell out of me every day, and I'm working like 14 hours a day, I'm getting kind of sick, I don't think I should do this anymore, right? You agree to do this, you sign this contract, there's no getting out of it, right? And so there were indentured servants who would run away, right? Just like slaves. The only difference is with indentured servants, it's basically white people who are running away into a colonial territory that's populated by other white people who are free, right? Same with the indigenous population. You try to enslave an indigenous population, you're basically enslaving somebody in the place that they're from, right? There's like woods over there that they've grown up in, and people have lived in for hundreds of years. They can just take off, and how are you going to find? You're not going to track those people down. And they can blend in with their own population. With African slaves, it's a lot. You're taking people from a completely different part of the world, you're transplanting them somewhere they have no familiarity with, really, and they stand out very easily. So it's easier to locate them. So that's one reason that slavery becomes a more dominant system of labor. But they can both be bought and sold, right? Indentured people sign contracts. Slaves are bought and sold as property, right? They are human property in law. By 1705. in this century, in the 17th century, this is when laws are basically written to make African slaves legal property, right? And that's something that when people do that, there's especially after the revolution, when we have these ideas codified in like law that we're all equal, that we all have rights. When a system of labor like this exists, there's a need to sort of justify it. Like, how can we believe in democracy or believe in freedom when we have all of these people we own? And so there's these ideas of, well, they're inferior, they're savage, they're not Christian, they're not white, right? So all of these ideas around race that we see today, and a lot of it's part of our political dialogue, when it comes to like Black Lives Matter or all these civil rights issues. You look at the civil rights movement, a lot of these issues around race and racism really take root in our like the last 500 years, during this time period. It's a socially constructed thing, right? So there was a need for labor. They become dependent on this group of labor, and they need to justify that, right? They need to justify to themselves and so they, because it's clearly it's a very brutal system of labor. There's a lot of physical abuse, there's sexual assault, all sorts of stuff. So they're considered human property, right? They're not somebody sitting and signing they don't go to West Africa and go to shore and talk to people in villages and in these different kingdoms and say, hey, you want to come work in America? Sign here. They just take like prisoners of war, massive amounts of people that have been captured for whatever reason, who are chained up, and they put them in the bottom of a boat, like they would with molasses or rum or sugar or rice or anything. Right? It's another law. So so jure is like judicial. It's in law. It's written down. It's actually like an explicit law. De facto means it's actually like slave. De facto marriage for slaves means that slaves could get married, right? A male and a female slave on a plantation could marry each other and have children. Those marriages are not legally recognized, right? So when their owner maybe goes into debt and has to sell off some of his property, he could take that couple, he could take their child and sell it because it's not really their child, it's his property. They're not really a husband and wife, they are property of another person, right? But indentured servants can get married if they have permission from their owner, and those marriages are legally recognized, right? And also when it comes to the issue of children, there are actually laws written in 1662 in Virginia, 1662. There is a law passed it's called the House of Burgesses. It's like the legislature of Virginia. There's a law that states that any child that's born in the Virginia colony, that whether they're considered free or slave, whether their status is dependent on what their mother's status is. So if their mother's a slave, then the child is a slave, regardless of who the father is, right? So, this is basically, who's familiar with Thomas Jefferson and the relationship he did have with his slave, right? This basically is a legal encouragement of rape, right? If a slave owner, you purchase a female slave from West Africa, from Mali or Ghana or somewhere. She can be 14 or 15 years old, and you're looking at like systematic, like repeated sexual assault over the course of her entire adult life. And she can produce 5, 6, 7, 8 children. All of those people are property now of the slave owner and the person who is basically raping this other person. They're being encouraged. They're being protected in law to do so. They're being rewarded financially because you purchase. This is one of the ways in which slavery is able to become a more dominant system of labor than indentured servants, are more preferred, right? Because you buy because the purchasing an indentured contract is a lot less expensive than purchasing a slave, right? You purchase a slave, the idea is you're going to own them outright for their whole life. So it's more expensive up front. A slave could be $800 or something. Like, I'm not sure. They've tried to figure out the equivalent value, like in our own in money today, and there's all sorts of speculation. But like the slave, you go to a slave auction, you purchase a slave for $800. You own them their whole life, and maybe even if it's a female slave, any children they produce could be yours. But that slave could die in 2 years, right? They just got here. You buy them, take them to your plantation, and they could get sick and die within a couple of years. So it's not, and you lose all that. You lose out on that. It sounds messed up, but you lose out on that investment. With indentured servant, the same thing could happen. They could die in a couple of years, but you only paid a small amount. I don't know. I tried to find what indentured contracts actually sold for, and with inflation, I'm not quite sure. But I think it was substantially less. I couldn't find an exact number. For some reason, $50 sounds good in my head compared to $800. It's like something. It would be something like that. It was a very nominal amount, right? Because and at the end of that contract, you're supposed to promise this person, yeah, I'll give you some land. I'll give you some piece of land and some money or something, right? And that made more sense because usually you didn't have to give them anything because they would die. So you paid a smaller amount and you'd work them for a few years and then they would die and then you just go buy another indenture contract somewhere, right? Now once the colonies become more developed and settled, people start living longer. People start living out these contracts and now they want that piece of land that you promised them at the beginning, right? I'm alive still. For the last 5 years I've worked for you. Now where's my 50 acres of land, right? And there was in Virginia there was what's called a head right system. Head right, in quotations. Basically, if you immigrate to Virginia, you get a certain amount of land. In Virginia, it was 50 acres. In I think both Carolinas, North and South Carolina, when they develop as colonies later, they're going to make it 150 acres. If you move there, just encouraging people to come there, you get 50 acres of land. Right?
Who's giving it to them?
Huh?
Who's giving it to them?
England. All of these colonies are established they're basically government charters, right? Like they have private investors. They're private investors who fork over the money basically because they're investing in something that they think is going to produce profit, right? They're going to in Virginia there's no gold, there's no silver like there was in Spanish colonial territory, so they start growing tobacco. Tobacco becomes the cash crop of those colonies, right? Or in other places it's sugar and so you have private investors, but they have to have some sort of government sanction. It's called a charter. The government basically gives a stamp of approval, like, okay, wherever you settle, you have the backing of the government. And then a lot of times there's also religious, there's missionaries, religious priests and stuff that go on the voyage too. So you have it's sort of intertwined church and state and private investment all sort of backing this thing. And so they basically would say, so if you go to this colony, once it's established, you get a certain amount of land. And every person you get to immigrate with you gets a certain amount of land. So if you're a wealthy person, you get land when you first get there. And if you purchase indenture contracts and bring people into that colony, you get 50 acres of land for each person. So someone who comes from England who's wealthy, who is maybe wealthier and buys land and gets some land also just for coming there, every person they bring in, that's 50 more acres of land. Right? And if those people are dying before they work their contract, they outlive their contract, then you don't give them anything. You just get to keep that land. But as people start living longer, they live out these contracts, and then all of a sudden, all this land that you've accumulated, people are now wanting that 25 acres or that 50 acres you promised me. Right? So the idea of a system of slave labor, where they're imported from Africa, where there's no promise of freedom, you don't have to give them anything at the end. Not accurate if I said right there where it says legally, indentured servants are legally bound labor for 4 to 7 years. Slaves are legally by legally protected, I mean they're not protected, the owners are legally protected in owning them. Bound labor, and I didn't put for life because for life is not really accurate, right? If someone is a woman who's a slave, and she's a slave her whole life, but if she has children, those children are slaves for their whole life beyond after she dies. And then she knows their whole life. And if you have a daughter, that if she produces kids, your grandchildren, right? There's this thing, you can see this sort of, the law is set up in a way where you know that this is just going to be the way, the status of you and your descendants for however long, until it's abolished, basically. So to say for life is not accurate, right? It's perpetually, forever. Back then. So a lot of times you have situations where a slave might give birth, and if they were able to, they would go take the infant and drown it in a creek or something, or kill it, because that's got to be I mean, you can imagine like the emotional, the situation psychologically as a parent, you just give birth to this human being, but you know that this person's going to spend the rest of their life like dealing with severe physical assault and working. I mean, like eventually, like, you have slaves there. We're talking like 14-hour days, 6-7 days a week. if there was a full moon, they'd make them, you know, if it was bright at nighttime, some people would make them continue working, you know. And you're not getting compensated for that at all. And if you mess up, you're getting physically abused. And even if you don't mess up, you might be getting like raped repeatedly, like on a regular basis, like, you know, a lot. So, yeah. And that happened. That's something that happened. It happened for a very long time. And the slave population only grows. There's more slaves in 1860. When the Civil War starts, there are more slaves in the United States than there ever have been. 4 million people, right? At the time of the Revolution, there are maybe, I think, 700,000. It's less than 1 million, but the population just grows. And it's expanding, right? Slavery starts to grow beyond these initial colonies, these 13 colonies, 13 states, right? It expands into Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. There are 300 slaves in California when California becomes a state. They were brought in here before statehood, right? It's important because a lot of times, at some point, you're going to have a conversation with somebody like your conservative uncle or somebody that's going to, you know, people that say that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, and that slavery was going to die out anyways. It wasn't, you know, they would have gotten rid of slavery without the Civil War, but it was very much a system of labor that was growing, and that people who owned slaves were very entrenched in, you know, they were very committed to keeping it as a system of labor. It's 4 million slaves in 1860. In just a dollar value, if you added up the value of all of those people as human property, $3 billion. In 1860, $3 billion. That's without inflation, like today's value. In 1860, $3 billion worth of human property. It was the largest concentration of wealth in the United States. You took every wealthy person, all the factories, railroads, any sort of asset, and added it up, it was not as much as the value in those 4 million slaves, $3 billion. So you can imagine how, if someone has that much of a financial investment in something, they're committed to maintaining it. So, yeah. So indentured servants get what it was referred to as freedom dues. What's due to them when they're free, right? And as people start outliving the contracts and expect that those freedom dues, people either stop using indentured servants and just rely exclusively on slave labor, or they start offering less, you know, because they know people are going to live longer, so they say they don't make the freedom dues as, you know, generous, and so so people stop. You know, there's less of a desire for people to sign these contracts. Like, you're only going to give me you're not even going to give me land. You're going to give me some money at the end, or you're going to give me very little land. I'm not going to go do this. So people they don't go to Virginia, or they either don't come to America, or they go to another colony where they might get a better deal, and so people that sort of pushes people to become even more reliant on slave labor. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't they just stop and start doing the work on their own? I know that would seem like a reasonable, humane thing to do. I know. Sorry. So. The first 20 African slaves was interesting when the quotation I read earlier about freedom and lack of freedom expanding together in the 17th century. There's really a good example of that is in 1619, right? Jamestown is established. Okay. So in 1607, this colony is established. In 1619. The Virginia House of Burgesses is established. This is the first. It's basically the legislature. They call it burgesses because it's basically the legislature. It's a seat of government, right? So this is the first example of a colonial government in British North America, right? We have this country that's established out of these colonies based on government, self-government, representative government, right? And this is the first example, cited as one of the first examples of where there's actually a colony which sets up its own government, right? It's not being governed necessarily by England, even though it's technically a colony of England, right? They have their own system of government. But that same year, so the same year when they established their own system of government, right, which we sort of see as an early example of setting up a democratic or a democratic republican institution of government, right? The same year, the first 20 slaves arrive in Virginia. First 20 African slaves arrive in Virginia. But at least one of them, and this is another thing, one of them ends up gaining their freedom and ends up owning actually their own slaves, and definitely owns their own indentured servants. but that's in 1619, this idea of indentured servants are over here and they're white, and slaves are like slavery being identified exclusively with being black, being from Africa, is not necessarily. It's something that sort of develops in the 1600s. So that by 1705, slaves are considered property in law, right? So one of those first 20 slaves that arrive, one of them gains their freedom and then ends up owning his own servants. Is something that's cited. If you go on his name's Anthony Johnson. If you go on the internet, you guys go on the internet. World Star Hip Hop. If you go on the internet, that's something that's used a lot by folks to argue. Well, slavery. See, we're not. This isn't a racist country. Slavery didn't have anything to do with race. Look at this guy. He got his freedom and he owned slaves. It's true. This guy did own slaves. The Cherokee. A lot of members of the Cherokee Nation ended up owning slaves. That that remained in sort of like the southern part of the United States. There were a lot of slaves who got their freedom and then owned slaves. A lot of the time it was people who purchased their family members, right? If someone got their freedom, they would purchase family members and then didn't free them for whatever. I'm sure that some of them profited off of it, but a lot of the time, you could purchase like your wife's freedom or your daughter's freedom, or somebody could purchase their husband's freedom. And then what happens if you free them in law, and then people can be kidnapped and then re-enslaved all the time. You can imagine. If somebody's living, if you escape slavery, or if you just get your freedom, you could even go to Canada, and you're in Montreal, and somebody clubs you over the head, and you wake up and you're in South Carolina. How are you going to say? Well, you can't say, "Oh no, I'm free. This is wrong. This is something. There's a mistake." You're in a state where slavery is legal, where people who are black are pretty much all slaves. You have no. I mean, how are you going to get to like